Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this very special virtual presentation from the Martha's Vineyard Museum. My name is Nora Kyle. I am the manager of education and public programs at the Martha's Vineyard Museum, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight for this very special presentation by Bob Lammey, A Brighter Day Than This Never Dawned, all about President Grant's 1874 visit to Martha's Vineyard, the first presidential visit to occur to our fair island. It is our custom here at the Martha's Vineyard Museum to begin all of our programs, whether we are together in person or as we are now online, by beginning with an acknowledgement of whose land this is. We are here on the island of Noepe, specifically on Nabnocket. Wherever you may be, I hope you also take the moment to remember whose land you are on and know the name of the tribe and their ancestors who have had stewardship of this place and contributed to the communities that we all participate in today, for they are all still here and all still with us. Bob Lammey is the owner of the cottage where President Grant stayed during that 1874 visit and is an independent researcher who is here to share with us everything that he has learned about that momentous occasion when the sitting president of the United States came to our island, and the long-reaching effects of his decision not to run for a third term. Bob, I am very happy to have you with us. We are recording this presentation for future reference and posterity. If you have any questions during the presentation, please just pop them into either the chat or the Q&A, and we will have time at the end to answer all of them. Thank you all for being here, and Bob, they're all yours.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Nora. And thanks, everyone, for joining the conversation. So as Nora said, my name is Bob Lammey, and I feel very fortunate to own the cottage on Martha's Vineyard that President Ulysses S. Grant visited for 4 nights in August of 1874, arguably the most significant event to take place on Martha's Vineyard in its history relative to the island's popularity at the time. So this title, A Brighter Day Than This Never Dawned, was taken from the first sentence of an article in the Boston Daily Globe during that visit, when Grant became the first sitting president to visit the vineyard. While this discussion will tell the story and pictures of Grant's visit, I will also raise some questions about how his actions and the people associated with his visit may have had a very significant impact on his decision to run for a third term, as term limits didn't exist until 1947, and the potential relationship of that decision to the civil rights movement in the United States. One thing I want to mention about our discussion on Grant tonight: despite his incredible life and accomplishments, Grant was an imperfect person, like many of us are. Although it was well before the Civil War and 15 or so years before the time period that we're discussing tonight, Grant did own an enslaved man named William Jones for a brief period when Grant owned his own farm in the late 1850s, several years before the Civil War. Mr. Jones had been gifted to Grant by his father-in-law, and Grant did take steps to free William Jones in 1859, writing what was called a manumission paper that he submitted to a St. Louis courthouse to give Mr. Jones his rightful freedom and equal rights, to give his freedom, when Grant could have received about $50,000 in today's money had he decided instead to sell William. But he made the right decision then and went on to a career dedicated in many ways to the freedom and equal rights of all people of color. But I did want to acknowledge that fact about his past. Because Grant's trip to Martha's Vineyard happened 15 years later in 1874, I will be focusing on his civil rights record only as a president, which in the end is really an incredible story to tell, in that he appeared to change his views to help all people of color throughout his presidency. A special shout out to those who assist me with this research and what you'll see today, including especially Andrew Patch, Peter Jones, Edie Lowe, and Sally Dagnall, also selfless in their time and support. And I also want to dedicate this to my father-in-law, Richard, who we just lost a few weeks ago. He loved history and talking about Grant, so he's here watching with us as well. I hope you enjoyed this discussion even half as much as I enjoyed putting it together. Thank you for indulging me. Let us begin. An unlikely journey to Martha's Vineyard. So this is Ulysses S. Grant, and one of the most iconic pictures ever taken of him at the Battle of Cold Harbor during the Civil War, one of the most brutal and bloodiest battles of the war. To begin telling the story of President Grant's visit to Martha's Vineyard in 1874, it actually begins the year this picture was taken, 1864, 10 years before his visit. Grant had stated multiple times he had little interest in the presidency, once saying, "I do not know of anything I've ever done or said that would indicate that I could be a candidate for any office whatsoever." So what events would have transpired starting in 1864 that would explain his visit to Martha's Vineyard just 10 years later in already his second term as president? It all started with a very radical and unfortunate decision by President Abraham Lincoln. In the run-up to the election of 1864 for his second term, President Abraham Lincoln was looking ahead on how to help heal from a brutal war and hatred-torn country. Lincoln, a Republican, made a very controversial decision in an effort to bring the country together, something we would never see in today's politics. He asked a Democrat, Andrew Johnson, to be his running mate, to try and send a message of national unity in his reelection campaign. This is why you see Union in reference to the party at the top of the poster rather than Republican or Democrat. They easily won. April 9th, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrenders to Union General Ulysses S. Grant, effectively ending the Civil War. Also of note in the room, that's General George Custer of Little Bighorn fame, where he and his company of over 200 men were completely annihilated by the Lakota and Cheyenne Indians in 1876 in the now infamous Custer's Last Stand. Another person of note in this picture is Union General Orville Babcock, whose name is likely not familiar to you. Babcock personally chose this now historic site of surrender at the McLean House in Appomattox, Virginia, and personally escorted General Lee to this meeting site to meet Grant. He then witnessed Grant and Lee negotiate and sign the terms of surrender in one of the most historic moments in U.S. history. Remember the name Orville Babcock. It will be back. 2 days later, Abraham Lincoln gave what would be his final speech from a window in the White House, whereby he celebrated Grant's victory over Lee. Present in the crowd that day was a Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth, who apparently declared that afternoon, "This is the last speech he will ever make," as a conspiracy to assassinate Lincoln was already being planned. Then on the evening of April 14th, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender to Grant, John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., only 42 days into Lincoln's second term. A country in complete turmoil from the Civil War was somehow thrust into even deeper turmoil. The very next day, Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson, was sworn in as the 17th president of the United States. So now, just 6 days after the surrender of the Confederate Army to Grant, there was now a Democrat and a Southern sympathizer as president of the United States. So this was Richmond in 1865 at the very time Johnson was sworn in, and this looked like many U.S. cities after the Civil War. More than 600,000 Union and Confederate soldiers died in the Civil War, which was as many dead as every other war combined in U.S. history. Incredible. Following the war, white supremacists began conducting a reign of terror throughout the South, violently intimidating and murdering tens of thousands of Black people and many white Republicans who tried to win political power or simply tried to vote. The most prominent of these terrorist organizations, the Ku Klux Klan, was formed in Tennessee in 1865 after feeling empowered to do so by the actions of President Andrew Johnson, widely considered one of the worst presidents in U.S. history and certainly the most openly racist, often making blatantly racist comments during his own presidential speeches. That brings us back to Grant, who was still general of the U.S. armies and still immensely popular. Grant was vehemently opposed to many of President Johnson's policies, as he was very concerned that his policies would undermine everything that the country had gained by winning the war. At the Republican National Convention in 1868, Grant was nominated without any acknowledgement that he even wanted to run for president. He moved forward to the election, the general election, not as a desire to be president, but from a sense of duty to his country. Grant went on to win the elections of 1868 and 1872, both in landslides. After learning he had won the 1868 election, his first words to his wife Julia were, "I am afraid I am elected." His campaigns were buoyed by the influential Susan B. Anthony, leader of the women's suffrage movement, and Frederick Douglass, a national leader of the abolitionist movement, who actually spoke at the Tabernacle in the campground in 1876, just 2 years after Grant's visit. All right, let's talk about the years leading up to 1874. So following his election, President Grant promised prompt and decisive federal action against the KKK, and he did just that, responding with 3 force acts, including what was known as the KKK Act of 1871, and deploying federal troops to enforce it. The Klan was completely eradicated by Grant's action soon after, not to return again formally as the KKK again until the 1920s. President Andrew Johnson had opposed the 14th and 15th Amendments, which together gave citizenship to formerly enslaved people and the right for Black men to vote. Grant signed into law the 15th Amendment in 1870. His collective actions as president helped lead to the first Black senator and representatives in Congress. Also happening in 1874 was the aftermath of the Panic of 1873, a financial crisis tied to the fall of the railroad industry, triggering the worst economic depression in U.S. history to date. That lasted until about 1877. Major property losses in the Great Chicago Fire in 1871 and the Great Boston Fire the next year also contributed to the massive strain on bank reserves, leading to over 100 banks failing nationwide. While Grant was literally en route to the Vineyard, on August 25th, Thomas Floyd, a Black state senator from Louisiana, was murdered in the Conchata massacre. So despite the eradication of the KKK around 1871, violence against Black people was still a significant issue in the South throughout Grant's presidency. Grant would have surely learned of this atrocity during his stay, signaling there was still much work to do and likely raising concerns should there be a change in control of the White House and the federal government. With so much unrest in the country and such atrocities occurring in the South, the question of whether Grant would seek a third term was very much on the minds of all Americans in 1874. George Washington had already set an unwritten precedent of no more than 2 terms by a U.S. president. Grant had never spoken or written about it himself to this point, so the mystery remained. And who were the people or the issues influencing that decision for him? Would some of that be revealed in August of 1874 on a little-known trip to a little-known island called Martha's Vineyard, now forgotten to history, except for those here on the island? The Battle of Edgartown and Oak Bluffs. Now we have an idea, now that we have an idea, I should say, of the joyous state of the country, 1874 might be the most tumultuous and fascinating time in the history of Martha's Vineyard, even having nothing to do with the president's visit. I had to tell a short version of this, and maybe that'll be my next trick if they don't lock me out of the museum after tonight. The golden age of whaling rapidly declined in the 1860s, leading to financial ruin for ship owners and much of the island. This was the last of Edgartown's whaling ships, and it hit Edgartown hard. And while Edgartown was cascading into difficult times in the 1860s and 70s, Oak Bluffs began transforming the island from a whaling and farming community into an internationally known seaside resort destination. Oak Bluffs was formerly called Cottage City in 1874 and was legally part of Edgartown at the time. Cottage City became separately incorporated in 1880, but the name change to Oak Bluffs didn't formally happen until 1907. To avoid confusion, I'm going to refer to Cottage City as Oak Bluffs for the rest of this discussion, as that name was very commonly used even in 1874. Now, just to get our bearings straight, as I'll be using this map throughout this section, Here's the Methodist campground, known for the gingerbread cottages today. Here's the Tabernacle, the historic event center of the campground. And here's where Oak Bluffs Harbor is today, though it wasn't a harbor then yet. In just a few short years leading up to Grant's visit in 1874, Oak Bluffs saw an incredible explosion of transformation. Let's zoom in on the waterfront where the action happened. All right, you ready? Chronological order here. A new wharf for transportation to and from Oak Bluffs in 1866, which is where the Steamship Authority Wharf is today. The first illumination happened in Ocean Park, not in the campground, in 1868. The Highland Wharf and the Highland House were built by the campground in 1870 and 1871. The resort was beautiful, and you can see the wharf in the foreground, which is where Grant landed. Then the second and one of the most majestic resorts in the country, called the Seaview House, opened in 1872, followed by about a dozen other hotels in Oak Bluffs in the next few years. So a quick pause. Also in the meantime, there were hundreds of cottages being built throughout Oak Bluffs, including the campground. All this incredible development in Oak Bluffs was not going over so well in Edgartown, which had seen about a 20% drop in its population in just 5 years. Edgartown investors then made some desperate decisions to build some things themselves. These will be highlighted in yellow. So the Seaview Road was built by Edgartown in 1872 to connect Oak Bluffs to Edgartown. And yes, that's the road along State Beach today. Followed by the building of the Matakeesit Lodge in Katama in 1873, yet another incredible brand new resort on the island. In the meantime, the Methodists in Oak Bluffs threw in a horse-drawn railway in 1873 to transport themselves between the Highland Wharf and the campground. That's on the right there. Followed quickly by Edgartown then funding the building of the Martha's Vineyard Railroad in 1874, which would take passengers from the Oak Bluffs Wharf through Edgartown all the way to the Matakeesit Lodge in Katama. We'll talk more about that. So the three new things in yellow, all an attempt to draw people away from Oak Bluffs to floundering Edgartown. So let's take a closer look at a few of these amazing new additions to the island. First, the Seaview House, one of the most spacious and luxurious resorts of its time, located right in the shoreline where cars line up today to get on the steamship ferry. It was 5 stories high in the water side and contained 125 rooms. Speaking tubes connected every room with the office. The whole hotel was lit by gas and warmed by steam heat, and it even featured an elevator. This was the new Seaview Road, paid for by Edgartown, which connects Oak Bluffs to Edgartown still today and takes us along State Beach. We have this to thank for giving us Jaws Bridge. Oh no! Another grand event was the opening of the Martha's Vineyard Railroad in 1874. The railway started at the Steamship Authority Wharf in front of Seaview House, was paid for by Edgartown investors, and opened just days before Grant's arrival, again to take tourists away from Oak Bluffs. In case you're wondering, Grant never stepped foot on the new Martha's Vineyard Railroad during his stay on the island. The railroad ran from Oak Bluffs Wharf through Edgartown to the Matakeesit Lodge on the very south side of the island in Katama. So the Matakeesit Lodge, also a beautiful resort at the time, but even the railroad couldn't save it from financial difficulty due to its remote location on the island. And I get it because I can't stand to drive a car all the way there today. It was located about where the Winnetou Oceanside Resort is now. As mentioned, it first opened in August 1873, but went out of business for the first time in 1879, just 6 years after its grand opening. It opened and closed a few times for stretches under different ownerships after that, but closed for good in the fall of 1905. Beautiful balconies, spacious porches, fantastic beach and ocean just steps away. You know what, honey? Let's go hang out on the roof. The first trolley line on the island was completed in 1871 as a horse car line that ran from Highland Wharf in and around the Methodist campground. Reportedly, the horse railroad line ran directly from the wharf to the campground so that people attending the campground could avoid the sinful parts of Oak Bluffs. So an interesting thing with the 3 grand hotels of Oak Bluffs, the Wesley being the only one we haven't mentioned yet, but these were curiously, very curiously, were all set ablaze in successive years somehow. Highland House and the Wesley being the work of arson. The Seaview House was indeed suspicious. And the latter being the only one to survive, the Wesley, and it is now the Summer Camp Hotel in Oak Bluffs. All right, now that you're thoroughly lodged in 1874, we've set the stage for Grant's journey to the Vineyard. Let's go. Okay, Friday, August 14th, 1874, the Vineyard Gazette is the first newspaper in the country to report the president is coming to Martha's Vineyard. Wait, did you say the Vineyard Gazette? Breaking news. Somehow, the Vineyard Gazette broke the story of the president planning a visit to Martha's Vineyard, and it wasn't even close. And boy, was it exciting. Buried in the middle of page 2 of the paper on August 14th, 1874, and all it said was, President Grant and a party of friends will visit Oak Bluffs in the campground soon, it is said. So while subtle, this was still 7 days before the Boston Daily Globe and 8 days before the New York Times. So how would the Vineyard Gazette break this news a week or more before these other national newspapers? I might just have stumbled on the answer inadvertently, as also buried in another section of the Vineyard Gazette in that same edition, all by itself with no headline, was this: Henry Wilson, Vice President of the United States, was at Oak Bluffs on Wednesday. So we will find out more about Wilson's loose lips later in this discussion. So Saturday, August 15th, 1874, the campground holds its illumination night. Some newspapers had reported that the campground rescheduled illumination for the president, but that wasn't correct. Here we are on Clinton Ave in the Methodist campground where illumination took place that Saturday night. The event drew about 5,000 visitors to Clinton Avenue, and that was a huge number in those days, but little did they know they would soon have 30,000 people descend on Oak Bluffs for the president. Uh-oh, look out. Tuesday, August 18th, 1874, the campground holds a special board meeting. So quick thing to explain, the Methodist campground was run then and still is today by a nonprofit organization called the Martha's Vineyard Camp Meeting Association, or the MVCMA. For simplicity, I will just refer to the MVCMA as the campground, which was the nickname for it back in 1874 like it is today. It's not often that nicknames stick around for 150 years. Now, these are the actual minutes from the campground board meeting on August 18th, 1874. A special board meeting convened just 8 days ahead of Grant's scheduled arrival. Minutes excerpt indicated that a Reverend Otis Tiffany was present in the meeting to report that President Grant was invited by him to the campground and that he would indeed be coming. So now we know from the minutes that indeed it was Tiffany who formally invited Grant to the campground, not the campground itself, a fact previously only speculated by prior written accounts of Grant's visit. Now, this might be my favorite slide. There ended up being 8 separate board meetings by the campground between August 18th and August 31st in relation to Grant's visit. So the campground took exceptional care in preparing for the president, despite the short notice. But there were also 8 committees formed to prepare for the arrival of the president, including a committee to just form the committees. And they called this the Committee on Nominations. Other committees included transportation, escort, reception, cottage arrangements, subsistence, carriages, and horse car. So who was Reverend Otis Tiffany? Tiffany had just presided over the marriage of Nellie Grant, the president's daughter, in a lavish ceremony at the White House only 3 months prior to Grant's visit to the island, one of the most celebrated social events of the 19th century. This is Nellie's wedding photo. Tiffany actually owned a gingerbread cottage at 7 West Clinton Avenue here in the campground, and we'll talk more about that later. All right, Monday, August 24th, 1874, President Grant informs Tiffany of a one-day delay, as Grant was originally scheduled to arrive on Wednesday. So this is 2 days before the guy's supposed to show up. We're finding out he's going to be a day late. So here was the exchange of messages between Tiffany and Grant on August 22nd and August 24th. If time of leaving New York is changed, notify me here. Let nothing occur to prevent your vineyard visit. Committee will be at Newport on your arrival. Bring friends, accommodations ample, hospitality unbounded, enthusiasm immense. To which the president replied, steamer leaves New York on Wednesday instead of Tuesday as first arranged. So I guess if you're president, you don't necessarily have to provide a reason either for being late. Okay, so here's how he got to the island. It's a map of southern New England, and we're going to zoom in on Rhode Island and southeastern Mass. So he took the steamer, the City of Peking, up from New York, which was brand new in 1874 and was the largest sea vessel ever built in the US at the time. He took the City of Peking to Newport. There he met Otis Tiffany and the escort committee from the campground. He then boarded the Old Colony Railroad and took that from Newport to Middleborough, then down to Woods Hole and Falmouth. Now let's zoom in on the Vineyard in Woods Hole. In Woods Hole, he boarded the River Queen, which took the president and his large party to Oak Bluffs. That trip took 2 full days. If Grant wasn't scared of flying, he could have just called Cape Air and been there in an hour. So the River Queen was a legendary side-wheel steamer which frequently transported President Abraham Lincoln and General Grant during the Civil War, and was used for an unsuccessful peace conference during the last year of the war. It went on to operate as a ferry serving Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket until 1871. Now, apparently the River Queen has made numerous pop culture appearances, including on an episode of Scooby-Doo. So who thought you'd be seeing a picture of Scooby-Doo and Shaggy when you signed up for this? Now, we know there's been other presidents who have famously come to the island, but none came with the entourage that Grant did. In fact, it's very possible that the delegation of political leaders who came with Grant or were already on the island may be the single largest gathering of our country's most powerful political leaders outside of Washington, D.C. in history, definitely in the context of a vacation. So who was here? So here's the list. I'll let you read the titles yourself. And in case you're not familiar with some of these positions, the Chief of Staff, that's the person responsible for all policy development for the entire country. The Postmaster General was part of the president's cabinet and a very powerful position which held much influence within the party in 1874, unlike today's Postmaster General, which is more of a ceremonious role. The Surgeon General, Joseph Barnes, was the attending doctor for the president, including Abraham Lincoln and James Garfield. So this is 5 of Grant's cabinet members, including the vice president, on a trip to Martha's Vineyard. I have a really hard time coordinating schedules for a 2-day trip to come out here with my wife, and we even have texting. So also on the trip, the port collectors. Now, what is that? It's a position that got phased out in the 1960s. But in the early 1870s, the New York and Boston port collectors, get this, the 2 highest paid employees of the US federal government. They were responsible for collecting significant tax revenue for the US federal government from incoming merchant ships. Boston and New York were the 2 busiest ports in the US. The New York port collector, Chester Arthur on the left, would be president of the United States 7 years later. He had compensation that exceeded the modern equivalent of $1 million annually. At a similar compensation level, Port of Boston collector William Simmons on the right, in whose actual photograph I could not find after many exhaustive hours looking, was appointed into this role in 1874 by President Grant under much controversy, which we'll talk about shortly, but also remember the name William Simmons. All right, I would be completely remiss to not speak of the great man Gilbert Haven was. So the person who owned the cottage where Grant stayed and who the cottage is named for today, while I am honored to own the cottage visited by the president, I am equally as honored to own the cottage formerly owned by this man. Gilbert Haven, seen here in a younger photo, believed in the absolute equality of all persons regardless of race, gender, or religion. He crusaded not only for the end of slavery, but also for full social integration of people of color. He defended interracial marriage and supported the ordination of women in religion at a time when these topics were considered completely radical. He grew to become a staunch supporter of Grant's when he saw his, quote, resolute will to this thankless task of defending the rights of freed slaves and trying to bring the country together, end quote. In addition to Grant, he also conversed with many of the most powerful politicians and military leaders of that time, as well as Frederick Douglass, one of the great African-American leaders of the 19th century. His relationship with Grant was indeed a strong one, so much so that the bishop took the very controversial step in his church in Atlanta and other churches of publicly endorsing Grant during his many speeches and sermons in the South, and he feared for his own life in doing so. He urged the president to run for a third term and wrote, "A third term is the only hope for the future safety and prosperity of the South." Gilbert Haven was with the president each day of his visit to Martha's Vineyard. Tuesday, August 18th, 1874, Bishop Gilbert Haven is presented with the cottage at 10 Clinton Avenue. So just 2 weeks before Grant arrived on the island, the bishop was presented, or really gifted by benefactors, the cottage where Grant would stay. This undated picture was likely the day that he was formally presented with the cottage. Here's the bishop in the crowd. The reason I think it's that day that he was presented is this is almost certainly John Damrell, who the Boston Daily Globe reported as presiding over the ceremony. He was the fire chief in Boston and also very involved in the church. And he had presided over the Great Fire of Boston just 2 years before in 1872. That fire burned for 12 hours, consuming 65 acres of Boston's downtown. That's double the size of the campground. And it destroyed 776 buildings and claimed 30 lives, including 12 firefighters. And you may recall the Great Fire was one of the catalysts that led to the banking collapse and economic depression occurring in the US in 1874. A brighter day than this never dawned. Also the title of this whole presentation. So are we ready for the arrival of the president? Yes, finally, Bob, can we get to it already? All right, Thursday, August 27th, 1874, President Grant arrives on Martha's Vineyard. So this was Arthur Railton's opening sentence of his article about Grant's visit. And don't worry, this is an illustration of Richmond, not Oak Bluffs. I'll touch on the asterisk on the 3 days later on. So I've mentioned a few times, but Arthur Railton wrote what many consider the definitive account of Grant's visit, published in the periodical The Intelligencer in August 1987. The Intelligencer is now the MVM, the Martha's Vineyard Museum Quarterly, the museum's journal. So Arthur Railton, a very accomplished historian and author, also wrote what many consider the definitive history book of Martha's Vineyard. And sadly, Arthur died shortly after that book was published in 2012. So there was an absolute crush of media and articles written about the president's visit in 1874. For my research, I cited over 30 articles by 12 different newspapers who appeared to have reporters on island, and I'm sure there were many more. As noted before, the president boarded the River Queen in Woods Hole and made landfall on Martha's Vineyard at 3:43 p.m. Let's zoom in on Oak Bluffs and East Chop. You may recall there were 2 new wharfs in service. the Oak Bluffs Landing and the Highland Wharf, the latter being built by the campground. The President's Ferry came in at Highland Wharf. This is an actual photograph from Peter Jones of the president's arrival, whereby you can just make out the horse cars which contain the president and his party. He was then transported into Oak Bluffs to Bishop Haven's cottage on Clinton Ave in the campground. So this picture was likely taken the day of his arrival, as all pictures I've come across appear to be taken, all other pictures, I should say, I've come across appear to be taken the morning of his departure. While the Secret Service was originally created in 1865 to combat counterfeiters, its job of protecting the president didn't become full-time until after President William McKinley's assassination in 1901. But these are likely still guards of some kind to look after the cottage prior to Grant's arrival. Taking a look at the cottage today, the most distinct difference being the porch roof that was added about 20 years after Grant's visit. So this is the front of 6 Clinton Ave, with the Bishop's cottage being 2 doors down. Here's the same shot today. In addition to seeing some decor on the balcony of this cottage as well, we also have a better view of other signage on Clinton Ave that was awaiting the president. Note the "Welcome to our hero president" sign, which appears to be in front of 12 Clinton Ave next door. A great picture of this sign is in the Campground Museum today. Note that according to the Vineyard Gazette, there were 5,000 to 6,000 people congregated around the bishop's cottage when the president arrived. Note that the island population was only 4,000 at that time, according to census records. So it was more than the entire population of the island just gathered around the cottage. An estimated 30,000 people came to the island at the time of his visit, of his 4-day visit. We'll be coming back to this picture, which was likely taken on the day of departure rather than arrival, but I wanted to illustrate how the crowds were probably still gathered around the cottage when he arrived to try to get a glimpse of the president. So per the Boston Daily Globe, the president was welcomed on his arrival by Reverend Micah Talbot, the president of the campground in 1874, and he said the following: "Mr. President, we welcome you in the name of the Camp Meeting Association to our grounds and our homes. We pray that your administration may continue to be as prosperous as it has been hitherto, and that your visit here may be as pleasant to as it already is to us." Here's the front of the cottage, again, likely taken on the day of departure, but looking from left to right, we do see Orville Babcock, Chief of Staff to Grant, and his wife Annie, the president and his wife Julia, and Miss Anna Barnes in the center of the doorway, who also stayed at the cottage, and we'll talk more about them later. But if we zoom in on the front bunting, where we see the words "E pluribus unum," which stands for "out of many, one," which was one of the slogans of the US government referring to the US states that were now one country, very apropos at the time following the Civil War. Here's another angle that gives us a view of the upper balcony to the spire at the top. You will see the image here of a US flag that appears to be hanging between the spire and a tree, perhaps. All photos that this appears in are quite blurry of the flag, likely just due to the wind and the shutter speeds at the time. So going back to the front door, if we zoom in, we can just make out the image of a mysterious man standing in the doorway, who I think could be the Port of Boston collector, William Simmons, who we know was there all 4 days and was actually the one who paid for the decorations at the cottage, not the campground. He doesn't appear in any other photo that we know of, but there is some resemblance to this confirmed drawing we have of him. Now, if we head inside the cottage, here is the front parlor of the cottage for the president's arrival. You'll note the center chandelier, which I still have a hole in my ceiling for this hook. There's a beautiful bouquet of flowers on the middle table, and you'll also note the doorway to what was the bishop's bedroom on the left. That is no longer there today, so we have no access to that room. I'm just kidding. There's a doorway in the back. Here's a modern day view. Hey, get off the furniture. From an article in the Boston Daily Globe, if we walked through the bishop's bedroom to the back, here we go, to to the back, this is the kitchen area today that, and there was a doorway at the time. The Globe described that this back room off the bishop's room was the bishop's library that was being used as a bedroom for Orville Babcock and his wife, who you may recall was in the room when Lee surrendered to Grant. And by the wall remnant and different types of pine floor today, indeed we see that these two sections of the kitchen were clearly built at different times. So the Kaiser family, who had owned my cottage for 70 plus years when I purchased it from them in 2018, indicated that the second floor bedroom that faces the side gardens of my cottage was actually the room the president slept in. This washstand that is in our Grant bedroom today was apparently original to the house, dates to that period based on the style and the hinges, and was considered state of the art at the time. You can see the makeshift toilet that folds out of the cabinet, which still functions amazingly well today. And you know, maybe, and that's as far as I'm going to go with the graphics. Also giving new meaning to the term sitting president. Sorry, I digress. So after freshening up at the cottage on Clinton Ave, the president went to the Tabernacle, a tent at the time, for a reception hosted by the campground. This is what it looked like back then, but I haven't come across any photos of the president while he was in the Tabernacle. So once finished at the Tabernacle, the president and his party went right into Montgomery Square for dinner at the Central House, right in the campground. Heading on into Montgomery Square. So this is the scene when you walk into Montgomery Square today, and this is what you would have been looking at from the same spot in 1874. The Central House was a longtime hotel and restaurant right in the heart of the campground. And one of the things I would have instantly liked about the Central House was I wouldn't even have had to leave the campground to get ice cream. Here's another angle with the arcade in the background, which isn't the arcade on Circuit Ave today. The old arcade building, as it's known, is where Sharky's is today. Standing in that same spot, this is what it looks like today. Then superimposing the hotel in. Pretty cool. After dinner was over at the Central House, the president then jumped back into the horse car and paraded through the campground and up Circuit Ave to the Tucker House on Ocean Avenue to watch fireworks at the Tucker House on the Circle. That has not been disputed. However, there is a common campground myth we'll discuss later involving the Tucker House, so stay tuned. But when the president arrived, this is what awaited him. And this is what it looks like today. It has been modified quite a bit from its original state. From this photo, you can see the top section that the president would have watched the fireworks from. And that's all I got for you, sorry. Another cottage with a prominent role relative to Grant's visit was the cottage at 7 West Clinton Ave, owned by Doug and Charlotte Taft today. The cottage was originally built by Reverend Tiffany in 1872 and subsequently sold per this listing in the Vineyard Gazette. And he sold it to a man named Amos Barstow, who we think is this gentleman right here. Barstow owned the cottage when there was a reception for President Grant and his wife Julia, hosted by Tiffany after the fireworks on that first day, as Tiffany likely stayed at the cottage as Barstow's guest. Barstow was the former mayor of Providence and a staunch abolitionist himself, but a very intriguing fact that came out of my research related to him. Soon after President Grant was on Martha's Vineyard and would have been in Barstow's cottage for this reception, Grant appointed him to a prominent federal position created by Grant called the Indian Commission to try and help collaborate peacefully with Native Americans, likely discussed that evening at 7 Clinton Ave. At the end of this exhausting day, and I'm tired just talking about it, we're still on the first day, the president and his wife returned to Bishop Haven's cottage for the night. Shortly thereafter, according to the Boston Daily Globe, and at a very late hour, likely close to midnight, a quartet appeared outside the cottage to serenade him. He came out on the balcony with Julia and was reported to have said, "I thank you for your cheerful greeting. No doubt you are tired and sleepy as I am, so I will not detain you. Good night. All right, unlocking the mystery of the third term. So in 1874, when Grant came to the island, he was in his second term as president, with midterm elections fast approaching in a few months, and in the midst of a nationwide depression. Grant was well aware of the risk the depression would present with midterm elections. Now, per Arthur Railton, the trip, which seems to have been planned in secret, probably had political motivation. Grant was being urged by some supporters to ignore the no third term tradition and run again in 1876. He seemed tempted to do so. Our own campground historian and author, Sally Dagnall, suggests there was an additional incentive for Grant. He could take care of his spiritual life and take care of his political life at the same time. Meanwhile, Grant himself once said the following: "There are three political parties in America: Republicans, Democrats, and Methodists." Based on his actions on Martha's Vineyard, particularly in the next 2 days, it's very likely Grant had aspirations to run for a third term at the time of his visit, despite his public silence through 1874 on that very topic. All right, day 2. August 28th, 1874. As if the day before wasn't exhausting enough, Grant set out on a 15-hour tour of Nantucket and Cape Cod, his first full day while staying on Martha's Vineyard. So the president's party once again departed from the Highland Wharf on board the River Queen. His party included the Chief of Staff, Orville Babcock, Secretary of War Belknap, and the Postmaster General, who we'll be talking more about later. Reverend Tiffany and Bishop Gilbert Haven also came along. But the curious absence from the trip was Henry Wilson, Vice President of the United States, who was previously a U.S. Senator for 18 years from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So he would have had a vested interest in joining the president on the Cape Cod tour as well. But he had publicly stated just a few weeks before this trip that he did not support Grant running for a third term. Can you imagine your own vice president making such a statement? So while he wasn't in great health that year in general, the fact that he made the trip to Martha's Vineyard with Grant and their demeanor being observed by a New York Times reporter as an icy one on the trip over the day before, his absence on this Cape trip would suggest a potential rift or a lack of political support by the vice president. And remember, he may have spilled the beans on Grant coming to the island in the first place. So in addition to being the first president to visit Martha's Vineyard, Grant was also the first president to visit Nantucket and Cape Cod per the Yarmouth Register. They departed Highland Wharf in Oak Bluffs at 8:10 a.m. on the River Queen and arrived Nantucket at 10:30 a.m., where they boarded a horse and carriage and arrived at the Ocean House for lunch. The building is still there today and is now called the Jared Coffin House and was the first mansion built on Nantucket in 1845. And apparently, this is an actual photo of the president's party arriving. The highlight of the stop occurred after lunch was over, when the president and his wife, Julia, exited the Ocean House and boarded a horse-drawn carriage to head back to the dock. The horses got spooked by the liveliness of the crowd cheering for the president and became runaway horses down the street, with the president and first lady in tow. The horses were reined in, so no one was hurt, but the first lady promptly got out of the carriage and walked back to the dock herself, which is about a 10-minute walk. But President Grant remained in the carriage and got a ride. All right, they departed Nantucket at 11:50 a.m. and arrived in Hyannis at 2 p.m. But keep in mind, they're looking to tour the entire Cape and it's already 2 p.m. The party disembarked from the River Queen and boarded the Old Colony Railroad once again. From Hyannis, they embarked on a whirlwind train tour that included stops in South Yarmouth, South Dennis, Harwich, and South Wellfleet before arriving at the new train station in Provincetown. After a few quick speeches by members of the presidential party, they again boarded the train to return to Woods Hole, with stops in Barnstable and Sandwich along the way. And despite the much later than expected timing, the presidential party received, according to the Barnstable Patriot, an enthusiastic reception everywhere. Now in Woods Hole, the president and his party boarded the River Queen to return to the Vineyard, arriving at 11:30 p.m. Now you know where I'm going with this, right? Now back at the cottage and exhausted, guess who's back? So according to the Boston Daily Globe, I'm not making this up, the president came to the balcony again and said, "Gentlemen, I suppose you are very tired, and we are. Good night." Day 3, August 29th, 1874, a visit with John Malcolm Forbes on Noshawn Island. So on day 3, the president set off for Noshawn Island, which is one of the Elizabethan islands that comes off the end of Woods Hole. Departing at 10 a.m., President Grant and his party soon arrived on the private island owned by John Murray Forbes. Forbes was a very wealthy and influential person in the highest levels of the U.S. government. He was an abolitionist who had staunchly supported Grant in his first 2 elections. Very little is known of Grant's visit that day to Forbes's mansion on the island, though author Railton speculated it could have been a trip to seek Forbes' support in running for a 3rd term. However, Forbes was vehemently opposed to a political appointment of Grant's in Boston earlier that same year in 1874. None other than Port of Boston collector William Simmons, who did not accompany Grant to the island. Per Forbes's daughter's memoirs about her father, she indicated that Grant's missteps with appointments of poor character men, quote, ruined any chance of overcoming the very general prejudice against a presidential 3rd term, end quote. This was further evidenced by a scathing letter to Grant just months ahead of his trip to Martha's Vineyard, supported by the political leadership of Massachusetts, including Forbes, telling Grant he is, quote, beset by evil advisors who will bring, quote, a future of bitter disaster and disgrace to you. Ouch. So Grant and his party returned to Oak Bluffs at 6:30 p.m. in time to attend dinner at the Seaview Hotel, the brand new luxury hotel of Oak Bluffs discussed earlier, which began as a reception in the pictured reception room. Apparently, there were several hundred ladies and gentlemen in formal dress in and about the hotel to try and get a glimpse or even shake the hand of the president. The reception was followed by dinner in the main dining room. And according to the New York Herald, those who were not favored with cards of invitation were peeping through the windows for a glance at the executive lion. Sadly, on September 24th, 1892, on its 20-year anniversary, the Seaview House caught fire and burned to the ground in less than 40 minutes after the alarm was sounded. Apparently, no lives were lost, and it's not clear if the hotel was in operation that night, given that it was late September, though apparently the gas jets were left on. So day 4, August 30th, 1874, services in the Tabernacle. So Sunday was the president's first relaxing day, but also his last one on the island, spent in all-day sermons at the Tabernacle tent. Bishop Gilbert Haven delivered a sermon in the morning, while Reverend Tiffany spoke in the afternoon. Reportedly, the bishop's sermon brought First Lady Grant to tears. Well, I'm sure the president was just suffering from allergies. One of the special surviving artifacts from Grant's visit is this chair, currently on display in the Campground Museum, and likely sat on by the president during the services in the Tabernacle. According to multiple accounts, Grant had a small boy on his knee during one of the sermons, named William Morgan Butler, whose family had a tent in the campground in 1874. That boy went on to become a United States Senator from Massachusetts, and was also a close associate and friend of future President Calvin Coolidge. Kind of cool. So incredibly, there's no record of what the president did on his last night of the island, despite the crush of media. So my theory is that he just did take out from Nancy's. All right, departure day. Monday, August 31st, 1874. So departure day was pretty uneventful. Beautiful weather was a great opportunity for pictures, and all the iconic pictures you've seen of the president in the campground were taken that final morning of his visit. We're going to take a closer look at a few of these in the coming slides. But before we close in on the unforeseen drama of the people on this trip, a quick note on the folks in this now iconic photograph taken on the front porch of 10 Clinton Avenue, the Bishop's Cottage, on the morning of Grant's departure, Monday, August 31st. This is likely the group that stayed at the Bishop's Cottage, which had 4 bedrooms at the time, though only the Grants and the Babcocks are confirmed as such from newspaper accounts as having stayed there. And I debated taking the time to tell you about the folks in this photograph, but because this photograph is seen so often now, I just thought it would be helpful to know a little about these people, and you'll definitely have a story to tell about the other gentlemen in this picture. So zooming in for a better view. Of course, this is President Grant and his wife, Julia. They're not that interesting, so I'm not going to talk about them very much tonight. This is who the photographer identified as Miss Campbell, whose first name was Mary. She was the sister of Orville Babcock's wife, Annie, standing just above her to the left, was 23 at the time of this trip. Sadly, their mother had just passed away a few months before this trip at the young age of 55, so they were probably mourning that loss together. Not much is known about her, though she did marry and lived to be 88, passing away in 1940. Next, identified as Miss Barnes by the photographer, her full name was Anna Fauntleroy Barnes. Anna was best friend and the maid of honor for Nellie Grant, the Grant's only daughter, who, as mentioned, had just been married and had moved to England by August, so she was not on the trip with them. Anna lived across the street from the White House during Grant's presidency, so she was probably equivalent to family to the Grants. She was the daughter of the Surgeon General, Dr. Joseph Barnes, who was also on the trip to Martha's Vineyard but didn't appear in any photos. Dr. Barnes was the attending doctor to President Abraham Lincoln after he was shot at Ford's Theater and is seen holding Lincoln's hand in this well-known deathbed illustration of Lincoln's death. He was also attending doctor to President James Garfield after he was shot and later died. Sadly, Anna, who was only 19 at the time of the trip, died at the young age of 44. And finally is Orville Babcock and his wife, Annie. We've previously seen Babcock as the person in the room at General Lee's surrender. Orville was a brigadier general in the Civil War under Grant and now chief of staff to the president. We're going to get into some shocking things with him in a moment, but quick mention of his wife, Anna Elizabeth, who went by Annie. She lived until age 80 and died in 1920. So the president departed that morning on the Monahans, another Civil War steamboat previously used by President Grant and now chartered by the city of New Bedford, especially for this trip. A large crowd awaited the president at the Highland Wharf and sent him off at 9:30 a.m. to loud cheers. While the president's Martha's Vineyard trip was technically over, the legacy of the trip would live on by the betrayals and damaging scandals of those who accompanied him, who never said a word to him, apparently, while together on the Vineyard. All right, a president betrayed. Let's take a closer look at the presidential party as things get very interesting now. You may recall from our earlier slide regarding the incredible list of political dignitaries who came with Grant to the island. Again, arguably the most prominent gathering of our nation's leaders in one place outside of Washington in the history of the country, certainly for what appeared to be a vacation of sorts. This picture of everyone gathered on the bishop's porch at 10 Clinton Ave is where we can identify many of the political dignitaries who visited. We'll zoom in on the group to be able to show who we definitively identified. So first, we have Reverend Tiffany, who invited the president. Then, of course, the president and first lady. Orville and Annie Babcock, just discussed, and more to come on them. Miss Barnes and Miss Campbell, also just discussed. This is Thomas Talbot, governor of Massachusetts. This is William Belknap, the Secretary of War, also more to come on him. Mr. Onslow Stearns, the president of the Old Colony Railroad that they rode on the Cape, and the former governor of New Hampshire, and Marshall Jewell, recently appointed U.S. Postmaster General by President Grant. He was a former governor of Connecticut and for whom there's a statue in Hartford, Connecticut today. So here's where it gets very interesting. Of the politicians who came to the Vineyard, we successfully identified 6 of the 10 on the bishop's porch. But we know from numerous news articles that all 10 were there on the island. So let's narrow this down to those who we think changed the trajectory of Grant's intent to run for a 3rd term. We've discussed the vice president and his lack of support due to the 2-term tradition explained earlier, and very telling once again that he was not seen with the president for pictures on the bishop's porch. You may recall John Malcolm Forbes, who Grant visited on Noshawn Island on day 3, who also decided not to support Grant due to concerns over his political appointees. And speaking of, Port of Boston collector William Simmons, recently appointed by Grant, who somehow managed to make an enemy of every prominent politician in Massachusetts who were convinced he was corrupt, costing the president dearly in terms of support from Forbes and Massachusetts as a whole. The Secretary of Navy Robeson, also a Grant appointee, was the subject of 2 congressional investigations following the Martha's Vineyard trip on profiteering and bribery charges from Navy shipbuilding contracts, which leaves us with Babcock and Belknap, who I'll call the killer bees. So first, Belknap, he was Secretary of War, perhaps the 3rd most decorated position in government in 1874 after the president and the vice president. He was involved in a scandal for many years, including while at the Vineyard, called the Trader Post Scandal, or the Indian Ring, whereby he received kickback payments worth about $500,000 in today's money from a Native American trader ship at Fort Sill in Oklahoma. Some historians believe that Belknap's role in the scheme led to much discord with Native Americans in the area and was a factor leading to the Battle of Little Bighorn, where Custer and his 200 men were annihilated by the Lakota and Cheyenne Indians. Now, Orville Babcock, there for the surrender of Robert E. Lee, taking pictures on the bishop's porch. Dude slept in my kitchen. Despite his record of accomplishments in the war, he was indicted in multiple cases of corruption during Grant's presidency, the most prolific of which was called the Whiskey Ring. Forgotten to history, the Whiskey Ring was a multi-year tax fraud and bribery scheme over several years and may be the biggest scandal in U.S. history by government officials, stealing today's equivalent of over $200 million of taxpayer money. And in fact, the investigation that was ordered by Grant into this, which involved the first special prosecutor ever in the U.S. history, by the way, began just 2 months. The investigation began just 2 months before their visit to the Vineyard. Babcock wasn't indicted until 1875, so Grant would not have been aware of Babcock's involvement in the Whiskey Ring at the time of their visit to the Vineyard. Babcock died in a boating accident 10 years after the Martha's Vineyard trip at age 48. His wife Annie outlived him by 36 years, but never remarried. So while Grant himself was never linked to the scandals, there was no evidence of his knowledge or involvement and was never accused of any wrongdoing. The one thing that most historians agree is that he was very guilty of his naive support of his corrupt friends and colleagues, which led to the Republican Party's decreasing support of Grant ahead of the 1876 election. Grant wrote himself, "My failures have been errors in judgment, not of intent." The South wins the Civil War in 1876. So referred to as the 1874 deconstruction of the Republican Party, the midterm elections in November of 1874 are disastrous for Grant. Scandals in the White House, an economic depression, and suspected widespread fraud, election fraud in southern states cost the Republicans 96 seats and their majority in the House of Representatives, which they had controlled for 16 years to that point. The New York Times, the day after Election Day, says it all. Great defeat of the Republican Party. The tale in the East is one of disaster. And in Massachusetts, Democrats gained a whopping 5 seats alone. Remember that trip to Cape Cod? Well, apparently didn't help him in Massachusetts, underscoring the potential impact of his controversial and much maligned appointment of Port of Boston Collector Simmons. And nationwide, the election map is almost catastrophic for Grant. So on what seemed like a very positive note at the time, though, subsequent to the Martha's Vineyard visit, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was signed into law on March 1st, 1875 by President Grant. Representative James Napier of Alabama infamously said to his fellow congressmen, "After all, this question resolves itself into this: either I am a man or I am not a man." While it was a landmark legislation and the first legislation addressing segregation in the United States, it was far from perfect for people of color, and it failed to have any lasting effect and was not enforced, particularly in the South after the election. In 1883, 8 years after its passage, the Supreme Court struck down the Civil Rights Act of 1875 as unconstitutional. Parts of the Civil Rights Act of 1875 were later readopted in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Civil Rights Act of 1968. But sadly, this was 80 years later. Now, it wasn't my intent to discuss tonight how or whether the friends and appointees of Grant suspected of corruption were tried or ultimately punished. Many of them weren't to the extent that they should have been. The point is, the reputational damage was enough to have a very material impact on Grant. It's difficult not to draw a very direct correlation to some events, and more obviously, the people associated with Grant's visit to Martha's Vineyard in 1874 and the potential impact on his decision to run for a third term in 1876, as he was well aware of the drop in support from his own party. As Ron Chernow wrote in his 2017 biography titled simply Grant, quote, it wasn't his nature to struggle for position, and he, quote, would never accept nomination tendered grudgingly by his party. Exactly 9 months after Grant's trip to Martha's Vineyard, he would finally make it official that he would not accept a nomination for a third term by issuing a letter to the Republican National Committee. Not ironically, that letter also came just 19 days after 238 people were implicated by the whiskey ring. And there's no denying that Jim Crow laws came about after Grant left office. So Jim Crow laws were state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation and existed for almost 100 years. After Grant left office, there was minimal federal involvement to prevent Jim Crow laws, segregation, and racial atrocities occurring throughout the South especially. And certainly not suggesting such matters didn't exist during Grant's tenure. The Black Codes in some ways preceded the Jim Crow laws, but Grant took decisive steps to address through federal troops in the South and prosecution through federal courts. That did not continue when he left office. Grant's departure from the White House seems to have set our country back with civil rights for almost a century from the gains it had made following the Civil War. That's this presenter's interpretation. It's hard to think how this could have played out differently if Grant had run for a third and maybe a fourth term before we now know that his health would have become an issue. Historian Christy Coleman said, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, but it was Grant who actually freed the slaves. Ron Chernow said, Grant did more for people of color in this country than any president in history. So we're going to dispel a couple of myths about Grant's visit to Martha's Vineyard as we head into the home stretch. All right, so myth number 1. The president's stay on Martha's Vineyard was for 3 nights, departing on Sunday the 30th after attending Sunday morning services. So we're back to this picture again. Why? Because this picture alone actually dispels both myths. So prominent historian Arthur Railton, who I talked about earlier, made a surprising error stating that Grant's trip was for only 3 nights rather than 4 in his 1987 article about Grant's visit. There is substantial and unmistakable evidence that the trip was indeed for 4 nights. The actual physical evidence is right here in the back of the original photograph. But there were 9 news articles from 7 different newspapers who wrote specifically of the Monday morning timing of Grant's departure, and none of which who spoke of a Sunday departure. The interesting thing about Railton's 1987 article is that it is often used as the reference source for articles today. Thus, there's been many articles since 1987 that have also incorrectly characterized Grant's trip as being only 3 nights. So look for that when you see an article going forward. Myth number 2. I love this one. The president was booted or locked out of the campground on his first day after being caught drinking and spent the rest of his visit at the Tucker House, where you saw that he watched fireworks that first night. So I got to give this one the full Pinocchio. And sorry to any tour guides out there who like to spruce up their tours with this complete myth. It's the question that I'm asked most often when I'm sitting on my porch. His dismissal from the campground for drinking during his visit. Did that really happen? I also hear most guided tours tell this story when they are outside my cottage, and I cringe every time. But this picture again actually dispels this myth, as there's multiple versions of this photo, as well as larger group ones taken the last day of his trip, many of which we've seen, that are dated as such. So we're supposed to believe that a second-term US president, who was the country's first 5-star general, who won the Civil War for the Union, yep, he snuck back into the campground on his tippy toes to take pictures the morning before his ferry was leaving. Someone also would have had to pay off at least a dozen news reporters to write 30 fabricated news stories about activities here in the campground after Grant was supposedly kicked out. News reporters, we know they fabricate things all the time, but making up every story and missing this one? So the board of the campground would have had to fabricate their minutes from at least 4 of their 8 meetings talking about the president being here after having kicked him out, and ignoring that they kicked him out themselves in the minutes. There's several things I could mention. There's several other things I could mention, but this list gets to a level that you're starting to wonder why I'm even addressing the topic, and now I am too. And unfortunately, the facts are getting in the way of a good story again, and in this case, a lot of facts. Well, not really to do with the Vineyard per se, but Grant carried much guilt with Lincoln's assassination, as he and Julia were originally invited to go to Ford's Theater. But the truth, apparently, as to why they didn't go was that Julia Grant couldn't stand Mary Lincoln, Abraham's wife, so they declined the invitation. But what if he did go? Let's see what might have happened. All right, on July 23rd, 1885, Ulysses S. Grant died of throat cancer at age 63. The campground held a special memorial ceremony in the tabernacle on August 8th of 1885, with a prayer being led by cottage owner Reverend Upham of 12 Cottage Park, who also happened to be part of the escort committee that received Grant in Newport on his journey to the Vineyard 11 years prior. That's Grant's picture, which is hard to see. So I've superimposed a picture of President Grant as it may have looked. According to the newspapers, it was a wonderful ceremony. Not bad for a guy who got kicked out of the campground on his first day there. So that is it. Thank you all very much. Have a good night. Happy to take any questions.
Bob, that was absolutely outstanding. I mean, really, truly well done. As you promised, it was engaging, it was fun, it was informative, and I love the jokes throughout. Thank you so very, very much for doing this for us. If there are any questions from the audience, I haven't received them yet, so if you do have them, into the chat or into the Q&A, and otherwise we will release you to enjoy the rest of your evening with our thanks for your joining us tonight. And not seeing anything? Thank you again, Bob. It's been our pleasure at the Martha's Vineyard Museum to have you. Thank you to the audience for joining us in the virtual world this evening. And I hope you'll join us again for more informative and illustrative things in the near future. Thank you, Bob, and thank you all. Good night.
Thank you very much.